Right. Right, let's get to work. Right, hello all. So this is HQ. This is basically a home facility that I have where I do all my online lessons and the odd ad hoc in-person lessons. So today, what I thought I'd do is share with you a pretty simple, well, I guess you can make it as complicated as you want, but today I'm going to share with you some pretty simple ideas based on hip turn. So I've done 3 online lessons this morning with large concepts based on sort of how we rotate in our hips and how we move and how that can function relative to the shot shape and pattern you want to see. So let's just talk hip turn. Essentially, this channel is not based upon, certainly going to try and keep it that way, is not based upon quick tips, i.e. if you do something this way, that's going to make you immediately better. Truth be told, no golf coach will really know what you need to do unless you go see them, because you've got to track data, you've got to track your golf swing, you've got to track intent, what you're trying to achieve. What I'm going to try and present on this channel is a little bit more of a, based upon these types of scenarios, this may work for you. It may not work for you, it actually might make you worse, but I think where I would like to take this channel is more educational with a bit of fun and try and give you some insights into why I've made some of the changes with some of the students I've seen as of late. So basically, ad hocly, when I have a few lessons, online or in person, I'm going to share with you that content and that journey. So today, we're going to talk about how hip turn has affected or influences this type of golfer. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to ask these 2 students from an online perspective who sent me their swings over the last couple of days to really help us talk about how the pelvis can influence the golf swing. So here we have on the left-hand side a student that is, in his terms, struggling on a few pulls, pull cuts, and essentially would like to tidy it up a little bit, even to get to the point where maybe he starts to see a few draws in his golf swing, those sorts of ideas. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take him up to the top of the backswing and stop, okay? Now I know it's difficult to see the shaft plane, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop in a pretty simple red line to correlate where the shaft is. Here on the right hand side you can see a very, very different movements, and I'm just going to stop this gentleman and student of mine at the top of the backswing. Now we're going to see very, very different ideas where the shaft placement is to start with. Okay, so you can see very clearly we've got one that's maybe labelled in terms of laid off, so sort of already pre-shallow. And we've got one here on the right hand side that is, let's say, more across the line. So in many simple terms, the club is pointing to the left of target and one is pointing to the right of the target. Now, to be able to get a little bit more of a fuller turn, to be able to get a little bit more of a, let's say, an across the line looking golf swing, this type of golfer has had to facilitate a huge volume of hip turn. So you can see there in that sort of trail leg here, we're going to see a lot more hip extension, we're going to see a lot more sort of trail leg extension. We almost get the impression where almost the rib cage is expanding, maybe even slightly higher arms, all in a result getting that golf club into a higher position. Definitely taking a look at that trail leg, there's very minimum retention in any type of flexion ideas in that trail leg. Now on the left hand side we see a huge retention rate into that sort of trail leg. As a result, we see obviously a lot less sort of hip turn. It's almost like it's restricted this way. Obviously the arms can only travel to a certain extent. Now the arms can only really travel to a certain point before probably feeling like they're hitting a bit of a brick wall. Now these 2 golfers are going to work into the delivery relative to their intent. Now the player on the left hand side, like we've spoken about, has a relatively short golf swing and struggles with a few pulls, pull cuts. Now because he has a limited amount of rotation on the way back, but a lot of rotation on the way down, we're going to see a very outward hand path and a very outward, let's say, delivery of the shaft. Here on the right hand side we have a player that's a little more draw biased, wanting to hit a fade. Now, as a result of trying to hit a fade, he's trying to obviously get the golf club from not dropping so far from the inside. Now, both of those players are moving differently relative to how they proceeded from the top of the backswing, and the rest of their journey is their own to sort of talk about. But what we're discussing today is how trail leg extension at the top of the backswing can influence your mobility, your turns, and then in turn, your ability to control delivery. So obviously those players have come to the game from very, very different ideas. They've basically had 2 different upbringings in the game of golf, introductions, what's right and wrong, probably read some different stuff, watched some different videos. People have influenced them in a different way. And neither one of those really would be wrong if you influenced it correctly. But today we're just talking about, like I say, how the hip turn can affect maybe your mobility, where you can get the golf club at the top of the backswing, maybe some ideas what you can and can't do from those areas as well. So let's have a quick chat about how that pelvis can affect delivery. So for me, when we're talking hip turns, we have to understand in what context are we talking about, and that has to always come back down to a pretty simple conversation. What's your intent? I.e., what do you want to do? Why would you even talk about hip turns or not hip turns, creating ideas of trail leg extension or flexion, and in what rates, in what sequences, if you don't really know what's going on in your own game? Now, I think it's always an interesting conversation before you start messing about with sort of the ideas of trail leg extension. Think about what that might do to your game in general. So if we use the example of the two guys we've just looked at, we've got one guy, one golfer that's keeping, let's say, an excessive amount of trail knee flex. So the idea of maintaining or even increasing this type of movement in the leg work. Now, if you've ever tried this at home, maybe just try and make a few practice swings where you feel like you're retaining the structure of your knee at address. Now, I almost guarantee you won't really be able to turn too much. In fact, this is a really nice skill for those players that maybe swing a bit too long, lose control. You might actually want to think about retaining flex in that trail knee. But for those golfers trying to, let's say, lengthen your golf swing, you might want to take this out, because if you give this a go, you're probably going to find this quite difficult. So I'm going to try and make a few golf swings now, back swings, where I feel like my right knee is almost increasing knee flex. Now, immediately, I feel very restricted in the amount of turn I'm going to get. Now again, if I was somebody that got the golf club long, loose and across the line, then maybe maintaining a bit of knee flex might actually just shorten me up a little bit, get me a bit more compact. But on the same note, if I'm somebody that is, let's say, almost pretty short on my backswing, the golf club in a laid off position, and from there I turn really quickly, there's a real scenario here where the golf club can work too far out in front of me, essentially work across the delivery pattern, and definitely see more of a pull slice pattern. So in that scenario, and this is where it's super key, it has to be relative to your scenario. In that scenario, the conversation of maybe lengthening the golf swing might really aid that golfer. Especially when you look at his strokes gained, we were definitely losing, let's say, ideas of distance. You could definitely bring a little more to the table. Now, obviously, the easiest win on that is lengthen the arc. So now you're making changes based upon not only, let's say, maybe a bit of, you could even argue a bit of injury ideas, you'd have to test that, but you're definitely lengthening the golf swing, that's going to help, and you're probably going to influence the journey of the golf club. So if you take that golfer with a lot of, let's say, knee flex and start to extend that leg out, all of a sudden now the body is going to start to react very differently. Where you put the golf club at the top of the backswing might need still training, but there's an opportunity to move differently. And if you're moving differently, you can probably expect different results. So sort of the ideas of getting that trail leg to stand up in the backswing is definitely going to help that golfer find a different route back to delivery. In my experience as a golfer, the more a player works that trail leg extension, the longer the golf swing becomes. Typically, the longer the golf swing becomes, the more in appearance the golf club starts to work a little more across the plane. Now, how you react from there has to be tested, but I would definitely suggest he gives that a go. On the flip side of that, you've also got a draw bias player wanting to fade it. Now, where he's in at the top of the backswing position, in that long across line position, so you could basically liken him to someone like Shane Lowry, unbelievable player. You can hit fades from across the line. There are plenty of good golfers that do that. Long and across the line, and as long as you've got good rotational ideas on the way down, you can match that up. But if you're finding it difficult to deliver the golf club, let's say from your ideal club path, and you feel like from a really sort of deep position with lots of turns, a lot of hand depth, you find it, let's say, difficult to almost feel like you're working across that golf ball, then restricting hip turn might actually help, especially when you define it relative to impact. So from that example, with the big hip turns, we found that halfway down, there was still a lot of closure on the body. So the player in this scenario was still, let's say, closed off relative to the in target and not really seeing dramatic amounts of rotation. Now, it wasn't the fact, and it's not the fact that he wasn't rotating, he was just having to rotate back to impact so much to get anywhere close to, let's say, square. The rotational rate didn't match his swing speed. Now that sounds like a crazy sentence, but a player could rotate really well, but it doesn't match their swing speed. So that player got a massive amount of turn, golf club essentially up and across the line, and his rotational rate was still working, but it wasn't quick enough to get the golf club out in front of him. So if we just, let's say, shorten the dynamics a little bit less, let's say, length through big turns, and give him an idea of being able to rotate earlier, then we're just making his credit card feel like he can pay it off. So from that scenario, maybe not stretching out as much to a crazy amount is probably preferable. Maybe actually trying to keep a little bit, maybe 5-10 degrees more, we're not talking a lot, of a trail leg extension might just really help him start to find strike. I definitely find that when I practice or when I start to get into people's patterns, the more trail leg extension I get, more typically I draw the golf ball. The more typically the ball starts to the right, hit the line. Ooh. The more that I then try and keep trail leg extension, idea of keeping my trail leg in some degree of flexion or even squeezing it, I definitely feel like I cut the ball a little bit more. Now that's for me to know about me. Before you make changes, think about what this does for you. So for me, today is all about just giving you introductory understanding of that trail leg. Typically, the more that you stand up in that trail leg, the more turns you're going to get, the greater range of movement you're going to get. You might gain some clubhead speed. You might gain a bigger sort of arc. How that is appropriate to delivery needs to be tracked. So before we make changes, check yours. But a bit of information now on hip turn. Any questions, drop it in the comment section. Hit like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. I'm going to try and do a lot of these. If this is the sort of content you want to see a little more of, content, instruction, whatever this is, I guess, let me know. Speak to you all soon. Enjoy your weekend golfing.